Welcome to our presentation on the loss of habitat in early childhood environments. This presentation will introduce a new way of thinking about classroom design through the spatial conditions of emotion. By linking the built environment to cognitive development, educators and designers can create places that use emotions, memory, and sensory experiences as the primary driver for design of early childhood environments. First, let's introduce ourselves. My name is Swickard, and I am a designer based out of Seattle, Washington. My work in residential, interiors, and landscape, alongside my research, was inspired by Louis Barragan's emotional architecture. The foundation of my work is about replacing cold functionalism with culturally, physically, and emotionally inspired spaces.
Hi there, I'm Dr. Sandra Duncan. I'm an international design specialist for early childhood environments, author of 6 books focusing on environments, and designer of 2 furniture collections called Sense of Place and Sense of Place for Wee Ones. Now that you know a little bit about us, let's begin our presentation. Young children are losing their childhoods in today's traditional classrooms. Children's childhoods are being threatened by classrooms filled with plastic, gadgets with buttons, television and computer screens, and closed-ended learning materials. Traditional classroom designs are those governed by numbers, the correct number of blocks, the right number and type of books, the required number of centers, and necessary manipulatives. These classrooms are being governed by stuff. This stuff is supposedly equated to quality. In the past few years, I have been researching the importance of built environments and beginning to understand how these built environments have a very powerful impact on children's lives. Even though I have been instrumental in the designing and building of childcare centers throughout my career, until recently, I mainly focused on the 4 walls, the right square footage for the number of children, how many bathrooms and where they're located, egress and regress doors, and so on. Although focusing on these elements were important, I now realize there is much, much more to consider. Critical essentials are being overlooked and actually thwarted, resulting in an institutional and cookie-cutter children's habitats. These cookie-cutter habitats create a loss of childhood. It has been my good fortune to visit, observe, and design hundreds of early childhood built environments. Although there have been exceptions, the reality is one classroom looks pretty much like the other. If I blindfolded you, took you on a plane, and dropped you in the middle of an early childhood classroom somewhere else in the world, would you know where you are based on what you see? Probably not, because the majority of materials and equipment now found in most early childhood classrooms are specified and manufactured for early childhood environments, regardless of where the classroom is located, regardless of the population they serve. And to further solidify cookie-cutter classrooms, the physical design of an early childhood classroom primarily focuses on mandated elements rather than a holistic design approach. So early childhood environments have remained fairly consistent across generations of children. The result? Cookie-cutter classrooms. The problem is we are operating under an antiquated aesthetic code. we are operating under chaotic environments, function-oriented designs, and oftentimes sterile spaces. For example, one conventional aesthetic code is that bright primary colors are often associated with preschool spaces, even though we have the research that indicates primary colors can have a negative impact on children's behaviors, their ability to focus, and cognitive development. Ask most people to describe a preschool environment, and they will, without a doubt, mention primary colors, which is infused on the walls, the furniture, the carpet, and even embedded in the floor and wall tiles. In addition to primary colors, the acceptable aesthetic code includes lively decorated borders, colorful commercially produced posters, laminated posters, cartoon images of people and animals. There are many other traditionally accepted codes that permeate preschool spaces, unfortunately, such as the idea that walls filled with children's work indicates productivity. An abundance of commercially purchased toys indicates a well-equipped space, and that spaces full of stuff results in learning. The results of all this? Chaotic environments. Another traditionally accepted aesthetic code is to design for teacher-focused rather than child-initiated environments. This antiquated way of thinking means that the teacher is the provider of all knowledge, which translates to, open your brains, little one, and let me fill it with what I think you should know, rather than designing environments where children are encouraged to construct their own knowledge. This antiquated way of thinking about how children learn results in classroom design based on functionality. For example, building in cubbies near the classroom door for ease of access is a functionality design strategy, versus considering the importance of children's views from the door and not seeing custodial objects from the door. Although functional, custodial elements such as cubbies, changing tables, food prep areas near the main entry door are detrimental barriers, and they do not encourage children to come into the classroom. An effective classroom threshold encourages and welcomes children to transition from their outside world to the classroom's inside world. This focus becomes emotion-based and not function-oriented. An attempt to design easy-to-clean and sanitized environments, which has become undoubtedly extremely important in today's COVID world, some environments end up being sterile and institutional. The biggest culprit of sterile is the lack of texture, both physical and visual. It seems that educators gravitate to smooth surfaces for easy cleaning, and designers often overlook infusing texture into the architecture, building materials, and interior furnishings and finishings of young children's built environments. Breaking the aesthetic code of a traditional design is key to creating environments where children can not just survive, but where children can also thrive. There is also the problem of lack of connection between children, classroom, families, and community. Architect Mark Dudek define the classroom environment as an evolving landscape for children's exploration and play within the four walls and beyond. He said environment is not only the actual space and the walls within it, but the social and cultural forces that shape the space and are in turn shaped by those who use them. So, think about that blindfold and airplane ride example mentioned earlier in this presentation. Take a look at these images. I ask you, would you know where you are based on what you see in these classrooms? Probably not, because there's no connection to the environment, to the topography, geography, flora, fauna, culture, and there's no variety of spatial qualities. Did you have a special childhood play place when you were young? Where was it? What do you remember about it? The sights, the sounds, the smells? What did you play in this place? Who'd you play with? Anyone or by yourself? We have a tendency to remember with great detail our special childhood places. Cognitive experts say we remember because of our emotional attachment to the special place. Cognition is linked to memory. The research of Calkins and Bell demonstrated the notion that child development is, indeed, at the intersection of emotions and cognition. Think once again about your special childhood space. Your memory was beautiful. Beauty is intertwined with emotions, and emotions are linked to cognition. What does this all mean for teachers and designers about how to design early childhood environments? Remember when you reminisced about your childhood special place? If we can agree that cognition and emotions are linked, then it is easy to understand why emotions must be the cornerstone of design for early childhood classrooms. So you may be thinking, okay, I get it. I understand all these connections between beauty, emotions, and classroom design, but what does this all have to do with architecture? Well, let's find out.
Sandra and I have both been deeply interested in the intersection between cognitive behavior and the built environment. My research into this subject was based on the psychoanalytical work of Winnicott's theory of transitional space and Martin Buber's I Am Thou paper, in which they claim that there exists an intermediate area of human experience in which inner reality and external life combine, which contributes to the whole health of an individual. According to Winnicott, this potential space, as he would later call it, exists as a lens for which the individual sees his world influenced by his inner and outer realities, more specifically through his cultural contexts and physical and emotional senses. Or in other words, our experiences as humans exist beyond our inner thoughts and external spaces, but in the potential place between us and the built environment. An example of this potential place can be seen in the emotional experience that is universally felt in Notre Dame, despite each person's particular religious beliefs. By focusing on the intersection between cognitive development and the built environment, we can create spaces that are more than functionally oriented, but create meaning for each individual. This is especially important when discussing early learning environments. The spatial conditions of emotions, as I've titled it, is a specific lens for identifying the experiences an individual has in the built environment and creating methods of designing spaces based on the emotional experience you wish an individual to have. Instead of designing first towards function and program, an educator or designer can identify which emotion the space should elicit. Each space will embody a different emotion. For example, a church is an environment for the emotional experience of awe, where a theater is an example of the emotional experience of kinship. Once the designer and educator has identified the emotional experience you wish an individual or child to experience, you create an environment that is both spatially and culturally connects them to this emotion. These three pillars help explain our relationship with the built environment as an experience that is almost indefinable, composed of more than just physical sensations, but emotional ones. The first method in designing an emotional experience is to identify which experience you want your environment to elicit. These are a few of the emotional experiences that an educator or designer would want their space to embody. See below for kinship, thrill, power, and awe. Each one of these comes with a traditional set of spatial qualities and culturally relevant associations. The emotional experience of kinship, for example, is all about the interaction and connections between people. Spaces in which kinship is the primary emotional experience should include spatial proportions and cultural associations that are conducive for that. We'll go into this more specifically later on. The second method is designing spaces with spatial qualities and proportions that are conducive for the emotional experience you wish to elicit. For instance, a circular space is conducive to a kinship experience because the room forces the individual or child to look towards the center and across at others. A long, thin rectangle, on the contrary, is conducive for direct activities that involve moving from one space to another, like a hallway or a gallery. The proportions of these spaces matter as well. A church almost requires a double height space to create the awe emotional experience, whereas a sauna requires compression to create a meditative emotional experience. The third method, which we'll get into later, is to use culturally relevant materials, art, and associations that connect the child with their home and people. Using this framework of emotional experiences that are shaped by sensory and memory contexts, educators and designers can create classrooms or centers depending on the emotional experience they want to elicit. For early learners, these three emotional experiences are particularly important: kinship, thrill, and awe. Ideally, a classroom or center would be designed to incorporate each. Kinship, for example, is an emotional experience that requires space for the interaction of students with each other and their teacher. This requires a space that is focused towards the center instead of the front, and requires looking past oneself towards others for a variety of social interactions. Circular shapes or furniture are particularly useful when trying to create this emotional experience. A theater is often designed in a circular or semicircular shape for these reasons. For this presentation, we decided to use kinship as an example. For early learning environments, designers and educators don't just have to replicate classroom types they've seen before. We can draw inspiration from other spaces that people have loved for centuries. There are many examples of public and private spaces where kinship is their primary emotional experience. We've already mentioned a theater, but a city plaza is another good example of a space created for activities relating to kinship. You can see in a plaza how the designer's intended emotional experience was for public use and interaction. At the same time, they also designed the spatial proportions, which is the second method for creating an emotional experience, to be conducive for interactions. Washington Square Park Plaza's circular design, created with seating to look from the edges inward. This allows for individuals to observe others while allowing for interaction with other people immediately adjacent to them. The main focus, other than the art, is the water feature in the middle, which creates opportunities for play, an added sensory experience, and something for casual observers to watch while interacting with those around them. The plaza also has good examples of associations, the third method for creating an emotional experience, that tie it to New York City and America. For example, the commemoration statues and monuments for George Washington, Garibaldi, and Alexander Hawley are included to remind the plaza goers of its history. This creation of a sensory and cultural experiences is something that's missing in the design of early learner centers, even though it's important for a child's development, as Sandra will discuss in the next slide.
In her book, The Importance of Being Little, Erica Christakis questions if we really need physical walls of a classroom. The problem is, according to Christakis, is that children themselves are leaving their early years behind with a sense of urgency. The problem is we are pushing our children towards something in our classrooms. What that something is, we're not exactly clear. We have forgotten what it's like to be a little child, and because we forget, we trip ourselves up again and again and again as to what is the best way to support children. So we rely on the classroom's four walls and forget the importance of being little. Instead, we need to begin relying on the classroom called childhood.
So in order to achieve a memorable environment, the spatial proportions of learning rooms are important. Here are some examples of spaces that can contribute to the emotional experience of kinship. A circular space, as mentioned before with regards to a theater or a plaza, is an easy way of creating this. If a circular space architecturally is impossible, a rug or furniture arrangement can do the trick. The important thing to remember is to create a space that is different than others, one that is particularly designed for freedom of interaction within a specific activity, such as a science experiment demonstration, a school play, or show and tell. This is an example of an environment that promotes the emotional experience of kinship through its spatial proportions. The furniture arrangement allows freedom to interact in more than one way, contrary to the setup of a typical classroom, while still having a primary focus. Much like a plaza, the children sit either around their desks looking at each other and interacting with a classmate next to them, or they can sit along the benches in the back for a secondary type of social interaction. The type and variety of kinship spaces is dependent on the need of the early learning center. If there is no room for such places inside, for instance, using nature as a spatial component is a wonderful method. The Lehman Nursery School in Japan is a great example of using different spatial proportions to create different emotional experiences. You can see in the far left image there are opportunities for an emotional experience of kinship. The ceiling and walls reaffirm that this space is different than the rooms beyond, but still connected. The color creates a warm and focused environment. The furniture is set up to look inward at each other. You can see in the other images that this nursery school used light and spatial proportions to weave a magical early learning experience. The cultural associations of a space is the second method to create a specific emotional experience. We've talked about spatial proportions, but the materiality, art, and color used in a room or building are just as meaningful as spatial proportions. As an adult or child, we all have associations, cultural or individual, that remind us of home and our cultural background. Including these associations in the learning environment can be crucial to creating positive associations with learning and help create a feeling of safety by bringing pieces of home into the classroom. For example, brick has different associations than wood depending on the region of the classroom. In Nordic areas, wood is the primary material, and its presence can remind a child of a forest or their own home. Brick, on the other hand, would be a familiar material in more southern countries such as Spain or Mexico. Material associations can include fabric, color, and texture. Choosing the right regional one for the classroom can create a more memorable and beloved environment. Here are some examples of associations used in other early learning environments. Associations can range from vernacular architecture to universal symbols incorporated in doors or furniture, to the brick made in the same city as the classroom, like the Natura Futura classroom scene in the top right image. A great project to highlight is the Gohar Khatun's Girls' School in Afghanistan. Bob Hull, an architect from Seattle, blended a variety of associations into the school. Bob also collaborated with the schoolgirls to create the mural you see on the left, choose the colors throughout, and pick the local brick. These associations enabled the schoolgirls to have ownership in their school and bring pieces of their homes to the school since most would be living there. Associations that involve cultural and individual symbols create memorable, loved spaces that engage the child with their environment by reminding them of home. As we close, we want to take a look at a school called Kids Country located in Ohio and point out areas that center around a particular emotional experience with specific associations and spatial proportions. On the far left image, you can see the area that's meant as entry, as well as a place for parents to stop by for coffee. This space is meant to be highly social and has many of the characteristics of the emotional experience of thrill. If you remember, thrill is a spatial condition that requires a variety of places of interest, as seen by the coffee bar and the dramatic art piece hanging from the ceiling. You can see it uses different spatial proportions, such as a lower ceiling over the coffee bar area and a tall vaulted ceiling that leads you towards the classroom. It also employs cultural associations through photos of their historic town. In the image to the right, the classroom has all the markings of the emotional experience of kinship. You can see the room is oriented so the edges are occupied and there's a focal point in the center. There are areas of play for many or individuals, creating a variety of interactions that the child can choose. More cultural associations could have been used in the classrooms, with opportunities for art and nature. Also, a variety of spatial proportions could have been used to promote separation of activities and emotional experiences.
We hope that you have enjoyed this presentation on rethinking the classroom landscape with the spatial conditions of emotion. We are deeply grateful to the many people who shared their classrooms with us. If the ideas in this presentation resonated or intrigued you in any way, we're always happy to connect. Until we meet again, thank you.